Hello and welcome to another episode of Agency Leadership Live. I hope you had a good weekend and are as excited as I am for this week. And we've got a great topic on tap today, and that is something I've been wanting to talk about for quite some time now because it's a question that I get all the time from agency owners, and that is pricing. How do you get pricing right so that you can build a profitable agency, you can grow the business, you can attract the kinds of clients that you want? And so that's what we're going to be diving into on today's episode. As always, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to post a comment in the chat, and I will take a look and see off here to my right to see what might come up over the course of the conversation. And if you've got questions outside of pricing, I'll try to touch on those if they come in too. We're here to help you with your agency and grow your business, and that's what we're all about. So let's dive into the topic at hand, and I'm going to be using a little bit of help today from a whiteboard, and so we're going to start our conversation about pricing. And wow, my penmanship is atrocious, isn't it? Look at that. That's just, we can fix that. That's the wonders of it being a digital whiteboard. We have a little bit more flexibility. But where I want to start this conversation is by talking about your floor. And so what exactly is this floor that I'm talking about? And when I talk about a floor, it's the minimum amount that you can charge for a project or a retainer or any other work that you do to make sure that you are turning a profit. And I think this is overlooked in a lot of the pricing conversations that take place around professional services broadly and agency work in particular. There's lots of conversations about value pricing and hourly billing versus fixed fee, project versus retainer, and we'll touch on all of that in the time ahead. But the most important thing you need to understand is that you need to have your floor, which means you need to understand your costs, right? So if you don't understand what your cost structure is like and how much it's going to take you to complete work for a client, then you're not going to be able to make a sound decision about what that minimum price should be. And by the way, I'm not saying that you should charge the minimum price. You just need to know what that minimum price is so that you don't get yourself in trouble and you are building a sustainable business going forward. So, how do you think about the cost structure? And it's very easy to sit there and say, well, 2,500 sounds right for this project, 5,000 sounds right for that one. Maybe that's a number I heard. Maybe in my past agency, that's what we charged. But you really need to dive in and look at your actual costs. And this is something, there are resources on the agencyleadership.com website in the resources library that will give you a spreadsheet that allows you to plug in all of the information that you need in order to figure out what your cost structure is for work for a client. But let's look broadly at the things that go in there. Obviously, the biggest cost for any agency work is almost always going to be your labor costs. It's also probably the trickiest to figure out because it requires you to carefully estimate how much time it's going to take, what the mix of resources is, and then from there figuring out, okay, well, what's the actual cost to me of this employee? And the spreadsheet that's in the resource library helps you do a lot of this because it lets you put in basic numbers for salaries and a percentage for benefits, and then it does all the calculations for you once you just estimate the number of hours that different employees will be working. But the critical thing here is to try to do as best you can a job of estimating how many hours. And that goes for whether it's a project or whether it's retainer work or whether it's some other kind of engagement. You need to be able to get really good at estimating the amount of labor inputs that you have. And by the way, if you're listening to this and you're an agency owner, you need to make sure you're accounting for your own time too. This is a big mistake that I see small agencies make all the time, which is they don't factor in the amount of time that the owner is spending. And so there's a webinar that I recorded last year that looks at how to do project budgeting, and that resource is also available on the agency leadership website. So I don't want to go too deep into how you do project budgeting and how you do retainer budgeting. But I think the important thing is to make sure that you're doing it. You also need to keep some allowances in there, particularly for longer term projects, so that you're not always going back and having to renegotiate with the client because you guessed wrong about how much work it was going to take to do it, or you end up just eating expenses on your monthly retainer because you underestimated how much work is going to go into servicing that client. So build yourself in an allowance into your budget. Once you know what your costs are, then you can figure out your price floor. And the simplest way to do this, the way that will probably keep you out of trouble in most agencies, is to take all of your actual costs, so not including your overhead expenses, so things like rent and telephone and all of the software that you have to run the business, project management tools and that sort of thing, but the direct labor costs that are associated with that project, plus any specific project or client-based expenses that you may have, software that you have licenses for that, just for that particular client or project. So if you have to add an extra seat to your media monitoring platform, or you subscribe to some new service just for that client, that needs to go into that cost bucket. And so once you put in all of these project or client specific costs plus your labor costs, if you take that total number and you multiply it by 2, you will have a good estimate of what your price floor is. You should never go below that, because if you think of your costs in terms of those things, let's say that that's $5,000 for whatever period of time you're doing the work. So it's $5,000. That would mean that $10,000 is the smallest number that you could charge for that work, because that is your floor. And that sounds like a lot. Geez, Chip, why are you telling me to double my costs as a floor, the minimum? Well, it's because in that additional 5,000, in that between the 5 and the 10,000 piece, you've got your costs for those overheads that we talked about, the things that you need to do just to keep the lights on at your agency. It accounts for some of the over servicing or wiggle room that you need to adapt to client requirements as they go along, and it accounts for profit margin. And again, this is a mistake that I see a lot of small agency owners make, where they don't account for an actual profit margin because they say, well, I just kind of pay myself as I can out of what the agency takes in. Well, that's your profit margin, except you're converting your profit margin to compensation. And again, that's a topic probably we can go into deeper on another day, because you need to make sure that you're compensating yourself fairly and turning a profit, right? That's the reason why you have the agency, not just to get a decent compensation, but hopefully to generate some profits that help to enrich you even beyond that. So take your costs, double them, now you've got your floor. Okay, good place to start. But now let's take a look. What are some of the other things that you need to be thinking about in terms of your pricing strategy? So you need to think about the different kinds of models that are out there. And so the models that you might think about are hourly, right? That's something that a lot of agencies historically have done. There's the retainer, right? Everybody wants to get to a retainer model just so we get a nice, sustainable, monthly recurring revenue stream. That sounds good. We've got projects, which have really been coming on it's been very common in the digital space, but now it's becoming much more common across the board in agencies, whether you're PR, Marcom, SEO, etc. And so there's a lot of project-based work that's taking place, particularly now as companies are becoming more cautious and they're trying to manage their budgets a little bit better and have that flexibility. They're shying away from retainers and looking at projects. So these are some of the different models that you can think about in terms of how you're doing your pricing. And ultimately, you need to look at it a couple of different ways. And let's start with the hourly billing. And I know that if you're listening to this, you're probably sitting there saying, oh my God, Chip, hourly billing. I can't even imagine hourly billing. I'm always told stay away from it. And look, I am not a huge fan of hourly billing. I think that there are better ways to set up projects. But the reason why I don't like hourly billing is not because you don't make enough money off of it. It's because it creates an adversarial relationship with the client. And it leads typically to discussions with the client where they're afraid to get on a call with you because they hear the clock ticking as they're sitting there with you. They're concerned about how they can interact with you. They're sitting there saying, well, why did it take you 3 hours to write this press release, or 2 hours to make that change to the website, or whatever? And so that's the challenge of the hourly model. Now, that said, there are benefits to the hourly model. If you really have a difficult time estimating how much work it's going to take to accomplish a particular series of tasks for your client or to complete a project, or maybe the specifications aren't entirely clear from the outset about the kind of work you're doing, or maybe you're doing crisis work where it's really difficult to know in advance how much work it's going to take. Hourly billing can be a great solution in those cases because it allows you to make sure that you're being compensated fairly and you're also charging your client fairly. Now, the trick, of course, is if you're going to do hourly billing, you need to make sure that you get the pricing right there too. And so that requires you to know the actual costs. And there are different ways that you can do hourly billing. You can do a blended rate, which I would say is probably the most common amongst the agencies that I look at. But when I got started out in the agency world, we had different fees for every individual, sort of like law firms do. They have one fee for their paralegals, another for their associates, another for junior partners, another for senior partners. Maybe even the senior partners have different numbers. So you can look at it a lot of different ways, but whatever method you take, you need to make sure that you're pricing that hour fairly. And for those folks who say, well, you shouldn't do hourly billing because then you're only being compensated for the actual inputs you're putting in and you're not being compensated for all of the knowledge and value that you're bringing from your years of experience. And you say, well, geez, I can write that op-ed in an hour and a junior person might take 4 or 5 hours. That's not fair. Well, presumably your hourly rate is higher than that person that it takes 4 or 5 hours to do. If it's not, it should be. And whatever your hourly rate is, whatever your project rates are, whatever your retainer rates are, I'm going to tell you that chances are you are undercharging. Just about every agency I look at across the board charges too little for their work. And I generally end up working with clients to figure out how to move their prices up. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later in this hour. But I think it's really valuable to make sure that if you're going to price hourly, you're pricing for your experience, you understand the floor for that rate for your costs. And even if you are not someone who is planning to charge by the hour typically, it's good to have in mind your hourly rate so that if you get into a situation where that is the best outcome, you're not scrambling to calculate it on the fly in your head. Make sure you've given that some thought so you've got it in your back pocket. Okay, so let's go beyond hourly and let's look at project work. Project work is, as I've said before, becoming more common, and it's probably the easiest for you to estimate. If you've been doing the kind of work that you're selling to clients right now for any period of time, you probably have a decent idea how much it takes to actually get the job done. And if you don't, then it probably means you need to spend a little bit more time doing things like time tracking and gathering your information on projects and clients. But let's assume that you're able to give a pretty good estimate. Well, now you need to look at the project pricing in a couple of different ways. You need to think about that floor, but then this is really where you do start thinking about what is the overall value that you can bring to the project. And we'll talk about value pricing a little bit later. But in general, when it comes to project work, you can really closely align the outcome that you're providing to the client with the results that they're going to see and feel and experience, and hopefully some idea what their bottom line impact is going to be. And so all of that helps you price more effectively. And so now the third model is retainer. And retainer is, as I've said, probably the most common billing structure for agencies historically. And it's the kind of thing that everybody seems to want to have because it's that I know I'm going to get 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 25,000 from this client every month like clockwork. And so it can be very addictive to look at things that way. The challenge that you run into with retainers is it's incredibly difficult to price them properly. It's incredibly unlikely that you're going to have a true level basis for the work that you're doing for the client every month, which means that you are in a situation where you have to work for the client over the long term for the highs and lows to balance out and for you to be treated fairly. The other challenge with retainer work is that in most cases, I have seen that agencies they start out doing probably more work than they should because it takes time to get up to speed. Right? So in the early months of the retainer, they're not earning the kinds of profits that they should. Then it gets into a nice steady flow or rhythm in most cases where profits start to really look good and feel good, and it's steady, and that period may last 6, 12, 18 months, maybe more. But then there comes a point where you're addicted to the cash, you're addicted to the relationship with the client, and you start to say, well, I'm worried that this client might go away. And in many cases, the client hasn't even given any indication that they're looking to go away, but you just start to get nervous about it. And so that starts to show through, and you begin to overservice. And the overservicing in October becomes a little more on November and December, and it just kind of builds on itself. And then the client actually may say, well, geez, we're thinking about making a change, or we're going to go to a new RFP because we have to, or whatever. And then you overservice even more. So if you think about it in those terms, let's go back to the whiteboard here, and let's get a nice clean sheet of paper here. So if you think about it, you get a nice high profit margin, let's clear that off of here. So you start out with a low profit margin because you're over servicing, then you get a nice high profit margin, and then it starts going down, and then eventually it just kind of falls off the cliff. And geez, I'm a terrible artist, so maybe I shouldn't be drawing. But in any case, it's you need to be very careful about that when you are pricing your retainers, to make sure that you are pricing in some kind of a cushion to account for that, and make sure that you are in a position to handle any potential over-servicing that may come up. And so those are the different models that you can use for your pricing structure. And so now that we've talked about the models and we've talked about a floor, the next thing I want to talk about is this lovely concept of value-based pricing. And value-based pricing has become incredibly popular amongst folks who talk about pricing theory for professional services. And here's what the idea is. The idea is that if you are doing work for a particular client, some clients will get more benefit, typically financial, out of it than others. So here's an example. So if you're creating a logo for a restaurant down the street, and you're creating a logo for Nike, those are two very different clients, and they get very different value out of those logos that you're creating. And so the concept is that you should be charging Nike more because they get more value out of it than the restaurant. And I don't think anybody would sit here and question that the local small business is almost always going to be charged less by their agency than someone like Nike. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily engaged in value pricing, because it may mean that you're servicing one end of the market or the other. And my general experience is that most agencies tend to service fairly similar clients. Not identical, and there are exceptions to this, but most agencies, even if they're not doing so consciously to target ideal clients, they end up focusing and specializing in certain types of businesses or organizations that they're working with. And so value pricing becomes a little bit more challenging, because then you're talking a much more nuanced definition of what that value is. It's not that clear-cut difference between the local small-town restaurant and the big sporting goods company. So value pricing is something that you can do, but you also have to be thoughtful about how you do it. Because what it requires is that you really understand those businesses that you're serving, and you really have a much deeper understanding of what that value is that they're going to be getting out of your services. Sometimes that's easier than others, and part of this will depend upon the specific services that you're providing. For example, if you are helping with lead generation or something like that, it's typically much easier to understand what the value is that you're providing, whereas a logo is much more challenging to figure out what that actual value is. You may be able to say it's more for a Nike than a small business, but how do you quantify the difference in value for a Nike versus an Oracle or something like that? There are much bigger challenges and more understanding that you need to have of their business operations in order to get there. The other thing that I want to talk about when it comes to value pricing is there is a difference that's very important to think about, and it's value versus fixed. And one of the things that I find is that a lot of folks, when they say that they're doing value-based pricing, they really are talking about fixed fee pricing. And they are not the same thing. So fixed fee pricing means that you sit there and say, okay, I don't really care how many hours I'm putting into this. I know that this is worth 5,000, so I'm going to charge 5,000 for this. That is not the same as value-based pricing, because value-based pricing would say that I charge you 5,000 and I charge your neighbor 7,000 and I charge your other neighbor 3,000. But most agencies that I know who say that they're doing value pricing really are just, it's just another word for fixed in their mind. Because what they're saying is, and it goes to sort of the example of the mechanic who's going in to fix some specialized machinery. And so he's called in to fix this, $1 million manufacturing plant thing. And he goes in and he tightens one screw and he's done and walks away 5 minutes later and sends them a bill for like $50,000. And they say, well, but it only took 5 minutes. He says, yes, but it took me 20 years to develop the experience to go know which screw to go in and tighten. Okay. So that's fixed pricing in that case. It's not necessarily value pricing because you're charging the same amount repetitively. So don't confuse those two, because it's really important that you understand the difference. And if you're going to engage in value pricing, then you need to dig a lot deeper and really understand what that value is that you're providing. On the flip side, if you're providing fixed, you need to make sure that that fixed pricing fairly compensates you for the work that you're doing. Okay, so we've talked about a couple of different concepts here, but there are other things that go into your pricing consideration beyond the actual price. And that one of those things is the terms you use. And I don't mean the words that you're using. I mean, I do, because the words are in your contract that you have with the client. But terms are really important and can be used quite effectively in getting the right price. And so terms are things like, what are the payment installments? Is it, if it's a project, do you get a percentage up front and then throughout and then a final payment at the end? Is it all up front? Is it, there's different approaches you can take. Payment terms are in this bucket. And that's a very important portion of pricing, because if you've got a client who's going to take 120 days to pay you, which is not uncommon, unfortunately, for some really large organizations who are very aggressive with their agencies, and if you're going to be in a situation where it's going to take that long, you may need to boost your price up to compensate for that term. On the other hand, if you have terms where you get paid up front for all your work, then you may be willing to charge a lower price. So terms and price go hand in hand, and you need to make sure that you're thinking about those in the conversations that you're having and in the way that you're working with clients. And that, of course, takes us to the way all of this comes together, and that is negotiation. Okay? And so negotiation is critical to any kind of pricing arrangement, because it's very rare that you simply say, here are my prices, and clients say, yep, absolutely, we'd like to pay for that. So as an agency, you typically are going to have some degree of back and forth with your prospects or with your clients if you're adding on work to what they're already having you do, and that requires negotiation. And that negotiation means that you use those different levers of price and terms and other things in order to get where you want. And I think that the critical thing that I would say when it comes to pricing and negotiation is that you need to be very careful that any concession that you make on price comes with some sort of concession from the client on either terms or the scope of work. And if you don't do that, then they start to think that you were simply overcharging them to begin with, right? So this is not a bazaar where you're bargaining with a vendor and it's sort of expected that, we're just going to knock 10% off at the end of the day or whatever. You need to make sure that if you lower your price, that you also reduce something in the scope of work. And it doesn't need to necessarily be something that matches up exactly, right? Because part of this is the symbolism that you have with the client to make sure that they understand that there is always a trade-off between how much they pay and how they pay and what the work is, okay? So the concessions don't necessarily have to always be just related to the scope of work. It could be to those terms. So it might be that you reduce the price, but you make them pay some or all of it up front. It might be that you shorten the payment terms. So instead of giving them 30 days, you only give them 10. There's a lot of different, it might be that you have them pay by credit card instead of by check so that you have more control over the timeliness of those payments. Whatever it is, you want to make sure that if you give something, you get something. And that is a critical part of the pricing process and making sure that you truly do price for profitability. All right, so now let's take a look at how you get to negotiations, and that is by having options. And as anyone who listens to me regularly knows, I am not a big fan of putting out proposals left and right for prospects. I think that you should be doing draft statements of work instead. So you only do it once you've had a general meeting of the minds with the prospect and they're likely to be using you. That's the only time that you start writing up what your actual description of work is and pricing it out specifically. But when you do that, typically you will end up providing some options, either orally or in writing. And so, how do you provide these options to get the best price for the work that you're doing? And there's a lot of research around providing pricing options, but a lot of it comes down to typically suggesting that you have three different prices and you bracket the preferred the preferred pricing with something a little bit higher and something a little bit lower. Or sometimes you might anchor with a really high price and have the lower priced option only being slightly lower. All of them need to have things that are added and subtracted to make sure that you are creating the right picture in the prospect's mind. You need to be prepared for the prospect to take any of those three pricing options. So never, never, ever throw out something on paper or orally to a prospect that you're not willing to back up. So I've seen this before where agencies will put in some lowball option saying, well, there's no way that has enough for this prospect to actually get the job done, so they won't pick this, but I'm going to put it out there just so that they can see that I'm trying to be flexible. Well, that's a mistake because inevitably you will find some prospect that decides to take you up on that particular pricing option. So make sure that whatever you're offering to a client, you believe not only you can do the work for, but that it will produce results, right? So you never want to be in a position where you're offering something that you can't generate a good profit margin on, but you also don't want to offer anything that's not going to produce results that the client is going to be happy with, because otherwise what you're doing is bringing in some short-term revenue, but at the expense of your longer-term reputation. When it comes to the options too, try to make sure that the things that you're providing are realistic. Some folks do suggest anchoring at a much higher price, and I'm okay with that as long as it's realistic. In other words, if you've got a client who's coming in and there's no way in heck that they're ever going to spend $50,000 a month, please don't suggest $50,000 a month. Use it to stretch them up to where they theoretically could pay. But if I go into a mom and pop local business and suggest $50,000 a month as my high end anchoring just to make my middle option look that much better, I just look like a fool. So it's got to be within the realm of believability. So think about that when you're providing options and when you're looking at the approach of bracketing. All right, so I want to add another thing to talk about here, and that is the market. And this is something that is increasingly important right now because the market is going to have an impact on what your actual prices are. So we talked about the floor, we've talked about some of the different methods that you can use to price, but then you need to try to figure out, okay, well, what is the top end that I can charge? What is the right amount to charge? And so let's go back. Let's get a clean thing here because you basically got a wide swath, right? So this is 0, and let's say that this is 1 million, okay? And so your floor is somewhere in here, right? So this is your floor. But then you've got all of this room to maneuver in between. And so how do you figure out, should I be here? Should I be here? Where should I go with my pricing? And so part of that is going to be based on the market. And so when I talk about the market, it's a couple of different things. Market is perhaps some market research. It's understanding what other agencies are charging. How are they competing in this space? And particularly right now, as we're going through an economic shock, you're going to have more price pressure. You're going to have some agencies that are out there and are willing to undercut you simply to get the business because they feel desperate for revenue. And by the way, being desperate for revenue is a very bad way to make decisions. So if you are in that position, make sure you take a deep breath. You're looking at your floor. You're considering what you really can do. So be very careful about that. But you may have competitors who are very much pushing in that direction. On the flip side, you may be looking at the market and saying, look, I don't want to be competitive near the lower end, and instead I want premium pricing. And I know many agencies that really try to make sure that they are actually at the top end of the market that they are competing for, because in some respects, prospects, clients do judge based on what they're paying. I mean, if I go out and I find a lawyer who's only going to charge me $10 an hour, chances are I'm not going to think he's very valuable. Whereas if I've got a lawyer out there who's going to be charging $750 an hour or $2,000 an hour, I'm going to sit there and say, wow, she must be really good to be able to command those kinds of fees. So you can use your pricing as a way to signal to your market your quality, your abilities. Obviously, it's a delicate balancing act. Because I've already said most of you are likely undercharging, my suggestion is that you continue to creep your prices up, and it doesn't matter whether that's hourly, project, or retainer, or something else. The more that you are able to ramp your price up over time, the more you'll be testing the market. If you're never getting feedback from prospects that your prices are too high, chances are they are really, really too low. So maybe advance them more aggressively. It's always easier to adjust your pricing with new prospects, new clients, than it is to change the pricing for your existing client base. So one of the ways that you will need to make adjustments to your pricing over time is by bringing in new blood, new business. And that's how you'll be able to test the market and figure out what's working. It's how you'll be able to figure out where is that sweet spot for your pricing, that you're able to attract the right kinds of clients, the right numbers of clients that generate the right kind of profitability for you. Now, of course, just as you use your costs to find a floor, you can use your costs to look and perhaps try to find a ceiling. If you end up looking at your business and all of a sudden, and we've talked previously on my podcast and elsewhere about general agency profitability. Most agencies are somewhere in the 10 or 15, 20% range. 20% is what I like to see most folks shoot for. There are some really well-run agencies that may get up to 25 or even 30%. Anything over 30% in your total profit margin, and the chances are that something odd is going on. You either have a really sweet whale client that's overpaying. Perhaps you've got clients generally that are overpaying. That will typically come back to bite you at some point in time. Perhaps it's because you're in a hot sector right now, and you're offering the services that everybody is demanding, so you can charge a little bit more. I've been in that position with businesses previously. 20 years ago, when you were offering a media monitoring service, you could really get premium pricing off of that. Obviously, it's a different competitive market space there today for those same kinds of businesses. So you'll have to make some adjustments over time if that's why your profit margin is so high. But unfortunately, the biggest reason that I see agencies being able to exceed 30% margin is typically because they are not treating their employees particularly well. And so that tends to lead to real churn amongst your employees, because what you're doing is basically overworking them to artificially reduce your costs on individual projects. So use the cost numbers to help you figure out somewhere in there, where that sweet spot of your pricing is beyond the floor, and look at your overall business to find the early warning signals. If your overall profit margin is under 10%, then you really do need to be raising prices substantially, or finding ways to refine your operating costs substantially. And if it's above, say, 30%, then you need to look at it and figure out, are you the unicorn that's able to generate those kinds of margins, or more likely is it that there's something else askew in your overall business model that may be working today but will eventually catch up with you. Okay, so let's look at a couple of other things from a pricing standpoint here. And the next thing I wanted to talk about, and since this is now getting crowded, I will put the main topic there in a circle. So the next thing to talk about is transparency. And historically, agencies have not been very transparent about their pricing. And historically, most agencies would not jump right out and say to people, this is what we charge. And now you're seeing more and more agencies putting some form of their pricing on their website, and not necessarily in a completely productized fashion where it says a website costs $5,000, a logo costs $2,500, a press release costs $2,000, whatever. That's not typically how it's done, but more agencies are putting things like minimums. And I am a huge believer in sharing your minimums, if not on your website, at least with prospects, particularly if they ask, what does it cost to work with you? Or, what kinds of, what's the amount it would take to do project X? I think you need to be ready, willing, and able to tell people what your minimum project size is, or retainer size, or whatever kind of work that you're doing. And you need to have thought that through. You need to actually have that in mind, because every agency has some kind of minimum. And it may be a really small minimum. If your primary work is for small businesses, and you are competing on the budget side, it may be that your minimum is only $250 for a project or something. That's fine, but know that and have that figure in mind. At the same time, many of the large agencies out there won't even think about working for you if you're not doing a 5 or 10,000 or even more than that month retainer. So you need to know what your own data is, what your own minimums are, and be ready to share that. Don't say, well, as many agency owners do, well, we need to talk about it and figure out what you're doing. You're wasting everybody's time. So tell them what your minimum is. Ideally, I'd love to see you share a range and say, look, we'd have to work through the details of your particular project to know precisely what it would cost. But most of our clients are spending between $5,000 and $25,000 for this, or they pay us between $2,500 and $10,000 a month, or whatever those numbers are. You should be willing to share that, because it does a few things. First of all, it helps ensure that you are making the best use of your time by talking to people who they hear a number and it's within what they think of potentially for a budget. It's allowing your prospect to immediately disqualify themselves and not waste their own time if what you're proposing or the kind of work that you do isn't a fit. I mean, think about it. Would you go to a car dealership that had no pricing on the cars? Probably not, unless you were at the truly high end of the marketplace. You want to have some idea, am I looking at a $20,000 car or a $200,000 supercar, or what? What am I even thinking about getting into? So you need to be willing to share that. And I think if you're willing to share that, at least a minimum or a range or something on your website, that's even better, because that allows people to short circuit their conversation. At the same time, while it disqualifies some people, it may requalify or bring some people in who might have said, geez, I thought you would be much more expensive than that, Chip. So, but now that I know that I could start working with you for $5,000 or $10,000, that's actually within my budget. So while people think that sharing pricing will scare people away, and it will scare some people away, it will also bring new people in who are pleasantly surprised by how affordable it may be to take advantage of your services. So find a way to share this either on your website or materials, or at least in those preliminary conversations that you're having with clients, because it does no good to have a prolonged conversation with somebody who knows that you are outside of their budget. And you can sit there and say, I'll just put together the best proposal in the world and they will go find the money. It's not going to happen. If they don't have the budget, and they know they don't have the budget, move them out of your process as quickly as possible. Maybe make a referral to someone that you know who they might be a better fit for. But please be open, be transparent about your pricing, because that will help substantially in maximizing the time that you're spending on business development, the time that you can spend actually growing your business, instead of having conversations that go nowhere. All right. Well, I think we've covered quite a bit of things here. I guess the only other topic that I'd like to talk a little bit about, so let's go ahead and put this on here as well, and this is the concept of the ladder. And ladders can be very effective in terms of working with clients to move them up. And so one of the challenges that I typically see agencies have is that once they get a client in the door, particularly if they're doing retainer work, they're at a fixed number, and it never goes above that. And the same thing with projects. A lot of times agencies will bring in a client, do one project, do it well, but then they move on. And so I think it's really helpful to think about your pricing model and your approach to working with clients in terms of having some kind of a ladder that they can climb in order to work with you over time, and in order to hopefully generate more revenue for your business. And so let's take a look at this ladder for a moment. Okay, and my drawing is clearly not my superpower here. So do not think that I am ever going to get into the design business myself. I am not. But if we think about the ladder, you might think about this first rung here as some sort of a discovery project. Okay. And I love when it comes to pricing, having something that's generally accessible to your target market. So something that is priced so that someone who is likely to pay the kinds of fees that you have for your main work is going to be able to come in and have that initial engagement with you. It allows you both to test the waters, start to build the relationship, see how it works. And so this discovery, it might be an audit, it might be an initial plan. There's a lot of different approaches that it can take. It might be, just a few hours of time. It might be a day or two of time. Something not too substantial, but it's a good starting point. And then from that discovery stage, maybe you go into your initial real project. Okay, and so by real project, and I should put that in air quotes, I'm talking about something that allows you to really showcase your abilities as an agency. But it's not quite as risky for the client as committing to a longer term retainer or a really big project. And so there's a lot of different approaches. An agency might make this, a targeted media campaign, but very very focused, or it might be building out some landing pages before redoing a whole website if you're a digital firm, or if you're an SEO agency, maybe it's looking at some particular subset of keywords. There's a lot of different initial approaches that you can take to showcase that ability. And then from there, that's where you start looking at, your media projects, um, and from there, moving on to retainers or other much larger scale engagements. So large scale. There we go. And so those are the different kinds of things that you can do to move people up that ladder. And so basically, if you think about it sort of in, the menu terms that you would see on like restaurant and hotel websites, so, we've got now $4 signs here, right? So if you look at it in those terms, it allows people, typically they'll come in on this first rung, but perhaps they'll come in on the second rung. Doesn't matter where they come in, you want to try to find ways to continue to move them up that ladder. And so wherever they are on the ladder, you should have in mind where you'd like to move them to. So if you've got them doing, project A, you want to think about, what is this project B? Where do you want to send them? What do you want to do next? Because what you can then do is, while you're completing this project A, you can start to subtly message the value of adding project B. And so hopefully by the time you successfully complete project A and the client is really thrilled with the work that you've done, you've now created a scenario under which it's almost obvious that they need to hire you to do project B. Similarly, if you've got someone on a retainer, you can actually, so if you're, say they're already on this top rung here, doesn't mean that they're topped out, because you can actually take advantage of perhaps selling them an add-on project beyond the retainer work that you're doing. This of course requires that you put your scope of work correctly for those retainers. So you need to think very carefully about how you scope things out and what you're promising for them. But if you do that, then you can sort of I guess it's almost having a second ladder. I'm not sure the best way to describe it, but you get the idea. If you've got someone in there, you always want to think about what are the add-ons that you can layer on so that they have not just additional opportunities to pay you money, but additional opportunities to get value from their relationship with your agency. So we've covered a lot of ground here over the last 45 minutes or so. I hope that you've gotten some good value out of these. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me, chip@agencyleadership.com. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. As I mentioned, the agencyleadership.com website has a lot of resources that will help you with this, the budgeting documents and some of those kinds of things. There's additional resources on pricing. It's a topic that we've talked about on the Agency Leadership podcast with Ginny Dietrich before. And so there's a lot of materials that you can find that will help you. But I hope that this time has given you a good overview of how to price appropriately. Hopefully, it's given you the courage to examine your own pricing structure, to probably increase your prices, to work to make sure that every time you bring in a new client, you're perhaps asking for just a little bit higher rate with each of them until you start to get that pushback on pricing. And if you do all of those things, you can be like a lot of the clients that I've worked with in the last couple of years that have seen their prices double, triple, quadruple because they've figured out how to get their pricing correct, which then leads to profitability. Because after all, pricing is all about generating profits for your firm. If you don't get pricing right, you won't have profits right. If you don't have profits right, you don't have a sustainable business that's helping you to meet your objectives as an agency owner, that's helping your team to have safe and productive jobs, and ultimately that's allowing you to deliver the value to your community and to your clients that you want to be providing. So with that, we will sign off from today's live broadcast. Be sure to tune in on Wednesday at noon Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. in the UK, and all sorts of other times around the world. I look forward to our next conversation, and good luck with your business.